flooding around in Wellington. Alrighty, are you both buyers of things online, second-hand things, Trade Me type of purchases?
Oh, I'm a seller and a buyer on Trade Me, and
Ooh.
also a dedicated op shopper from a family of dedicated op shoppers. Actually, yeah.
I've done it
What
a
do you
few
look
times.
for? Sorry, I'm interested in the op shopping thing.
Oh well, I am very interested in vintage clothing. And by vintage, I don't mean stuff from the 80s. I mean stuff from
Oh, you and I need to go shopping
from
together.
50s onwards, 50s, 60s,
Awesome.
70s. And I also actually sell a little bit of stuff. Vintage Sisters on Etsy and Instagram.
Okay, that's enough. That's enough. That's your ad.
And so I'm looking for things for me and things that I can
Cool.
possibly
What
give.
was that?
a
Was it
new
Vintage
home.
Sisters, did you
Vintage
say?
Sisters, yes.
Sisters, yeah, cool.
It's a hobby business, I must say. It's not really a money-making
I was
venture.
pulling
But yeah,
your
so
leg.
I'm looking for old things, and I have noticed in op shops. This is a little bit of a digression, but the old stuff is much harder to come by now. True vintage clothing, anyway, than it used to be.
My son and a couple of his friends have a little online selling business of vintage American kind of preppy clothing. What they call vintage is essentially 90s and early 2000s.
I find that a bit depressing.
Which I've still
me
got in my
too.
wardrobe, and he just sneers at.
Yeah. There is. I mean, I think vintage has got to be at least sort of 40
Just-
years old.
it's all relative.
It is
Depends
relative.
how old you are.
And if you've worn it, if you can remember wearing it, I think, I don't know if that's really.
I don't think
can
I
call
ever
it-
wore
I
Tommy
agree with both of
Hilfiger
you.
polo
Yeah.
shirts, but hey.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I raised it is that the Salvation Army in Australia is lamenting online sales of second-hand goods. They say that donations from people are dropping because people are choosing to sell their unwanted stuff online rather than give it to the Sallies and get them to take it away for free, because the Sallies then sell it, obviously, and that's how they make their money. So we spoke to Gareth Marshall, who's the organisation's, our here in New Zealand, organisation's family stores manager, and he says he's not seen that kind of impact of people selling stuff online rather than donating, and he said that New Zealanders are still extremely generous. Isn't that heartwarming? Why do you think that is, Nikki and Finlay? Do you think? I just wonder whether we're too busy or lazy to bother with the online selling, faffing about, or is it because we are extremely generous?
Who knows? I mean, it is a bit of a faff listing something online. You've got to take photos, and then you've got to answer all the questions, and then you've got to, package it up and sell it. I mean, it is quite a faff. So unless it's something really valuable, I would tend to donate rather than sell.
Yeah, we tend to use the clothing recycle bins with things that the kids have outgrown and stuff like that. So
Yeah, I mean,
I find it easier. I'm not really interested in making money off old stuff, to be honest.
You've got to be quite dedicated, I think. Maybe that's
Yeah.
it. The thing that I don't like to see is people just dumping stuff outside op shops, because I know that
See
a lot
that
of the
outside
time.
hospice shops.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the time they just have to chuck a lot of that stuff away. It's not even good quality, not good enough to sell.
That's the other
Yeah.
thing. Donating garbage is not really
That's not
charitable
cool.
at all.
It's just,
Well, that's
no.
a bit of a cyclical story, isn't it, that we see on the news every now and then, normally in the lead up to Christmas when people are doing big clean-outs. And I remember people finding, dirty nappies in some of these clothing
that was
boxes.
a
And I mean, it's
awful
just,
story.
it's disgusting. But in New Zealand, Gareth Marshall from the Salvation Army says that he's visiting stores in the South Island and says that they're just as busy as they've ever been. And in fact, he says that, the Facebook Marketplace and Trade Me are actually helping make buying second-hand more acceptable and popular. So he thinks that it's a good thing because they are still getting stuff for free and then able to sell it online because people enjoy doing that. It's acceptable. Maybe it's more, I don't know what... Have you got children, Nikki?
I've got a grown-up stepdaughter.
Grown-up stepdaughter. I was just going to say, about labels and things like that. I'm fortunate that mine don't care about that kind of thing. So we do buy stuff second-hand. I see no point in buying something new if there's something just as good second-hand. I just wonder what your children were both like. Would that worry them?
No, not with Julia, my daughter. She was always into a bit of an op shop bargain as well. I think once they leave home and have to pay for their own clothes.
My son is an absolute clothes snob. And
Oh, really? Labels?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, but not just any label, let me tell you. And
Where
certainly
does he
not
get that from?
his mother.
Oh, of course. Lovely.
Certainly not his father.
Finlay McDonald and Nikki Bazant, lovely to have you on the program today. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Ellie.
And stay dry in Auckland. Tomorrow we have Ella Henry and Gary Moore on the panel. I'll be back for Gym. Next up, Checkpoint with John Campbell.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batten aho. Up to 800 properties in Dunedin are vulnerable to flooding and may have to be evacuated as the situation worsens. A state of emergency has been declared for Dunedin City to enable evacuations to take place. Here's our Otago Southland reporter Ian Telfer.
Dunedin's been pelted by 18 millimetres of rain an hour for 2 hours, and the city's stormwater system has overflowed, sending diluted but untreated sewage into the streets. The most affected areas are around Surrey Street in South Dunedin, in Kaikorai Valley and Mosgiel. Civil Defence is setting up 2 evacuation centres, and the Army may be called in to help shift people should mass evacuations be needed. A spring tide's hampering the drainage in low-lying areas and may leave thousands of people who live along Otago Harbour cut off. Civil Defence says it doesn't yet know if the flooding has peaked. In Dunedin, Ian Telfer.
A state of emergency has also been declared in Buller. There have been evacuations in low-lying areas such as Snodgrass and Carter's Beach. Buller Health is now evacuating some palliative and aged residential care patients due to concerns over potential flooding. The Buller District Council says water is now starting to recede in some parts, though it continues to rise in areas north of Westport. Thousands of homes across Christchurch are without power as high winds are bringing down trees and branches on power lines. A spokesperson for lines company Orion says there are currently more than 2,800 customers without power in Lincoln, West Melton, Taitapu, Akaroa and Littleton. In Taranaki, people evacuated from their beachfront homes in Waitara are being told to stay away from their properties with a king tide expected at midnight. High winds are also battering the lower North Island with more than 1,000 homes without power. Emile Donovan reports.
Both Wellington and Taranaki saw wind gusts in excess of 130 kilometres an hour today. Fire and Emergency is telling residents of about 30 properties in East Beach in Waitara to stay away from their homes after they were evacuated earlier today. A king tide is expected at midnight, and authorities fear people could get stuck in their homes if they stay. At least 600 homes in Wellington, Taranaki and the Wairarapa have had their power cut because of weather-related accidents, and at least 24 flights into and out of the capital have been cancelled since midday, with several more delayed by hours. This is Emile Donovan.
Auckland Transport is putting plans in place for tonight's king tide after this morning's caused gridlock in large parts of the city. Tamaki Drive had to be closed and the flow-on effect meant traffic was at a standstill in much of the east. Tonight's king tide is expected about 9 o'clock. Auckland's Transport's media manager Mark Hannon says the tides are an act of nature, but it's doing what it can.
We'll have engineers on duty and road crews there. And if the king tide repeats what it did this morning, we'll be closing the road. We're expecting the worst of the situation to be around 8:30, 9 o'clock this evening.
Auckland Transport's Mark Hannon. Canterbury firefighters are battling at least 7 blazes across the region on one of the hottest days this summer. This includes a fire on the Christchurch's Port Hills near Cass Bay, which is being fought with multiple fire crews and a helicopter. Last February, a 2,000-hectare fire ravaged the same area. Fire and Emergency say crews are also fighting blazes near Old Taitapu Road, Clarkson Hudson's Road, Carter's Road, Rotherham, Whedon's Ross Road and Newton's Road. It's currently 31 degrees in Christchurch. The government expects the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Historical Abuse in State Care will begin hearing submissions by the middle of the year. The inquiry announced this morning will be chaired by the former Governor-General, Sir Anand Sachinand. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
The inquiry will cover all directly run state institutions, including child welfare homes, borstalls and psychiatric hospitals, and where the government contracted services out. The Minister for Children, Tracy Martin, says the inquiry is about people, not institutions. So if they were in state care, regardless of where they were placed, then they're in scope. Following a consultation period, the Cabinet will make a final decision on the terms of reference, the additional inquiry members and its budget. The government hopes the inquiry will report back to it by the end of the parliamentary term in 2020. Atuiti whare parimata, ko Chris Bramwell aho.
MPs are to vote on whether to ramp up the punishment for people who sell synthetic substances, sometimes referred to as synthetic cannabis. A bill sponsored by the National MP Simeon Brown will be considered this year. The legislation would increase the maximum penalty on suppliers of the illegal drugs from 2 years imprisonment to 8 years. Mr Brown says the products have become more potent and were linked to about 20 reported deaths last year. He says stricter penalties are needed. It's 5:05. Sport, and the wrangling between New Zealand Rugby and the Warriors Rugby League has intensified, with teenager Etene Nanai-Seturo again named in the All Black Sevens side. The 18-year-old will play in this weekend's round of the International Sevens Series in Hamilton. Nanai-Seturo made his debut for New Zealand at last weekend's tournament in Sydney, despite having signed a 5-year deal with the Warriors 3 years ago. That led Warriors Chief Executive Cameron George to threaten legal action, but New Zealand Rugby said its legal advice was that Nanai-Seturo could play. Asked if he was surprised by the decision to pick Nanai-Seturo for Hamilton, George was reticent to comment.
It's in the hands of our lawyers, so I can't really comment any further than that. Entirely up to New Zealand Rugby what they wish to do.
Warriors CEO Cameron George. Chelsea and Manchester United have both suffered humbling English Premier League football losses. Fourth-placed Chelsea were humiliated 3-0 at home by Bournemouth, while Tottenham Hotspur solidified their top 4 credentials with a dominant 2-0 win over second-placed Manchester United in front of a record Premier League crowd at Wembley. League leaders Manchester City beat West Brom 3-0. And a Russian government official is warning that swarms of locusts could attack football pitches and cause a global scandal at this year's World Cup, claiming around 1 million hectares of land in southern Russia is infected with locusts. That's the news.
Over the moon.
I kind of thought of it as a really dark, sort of almost marmalade-y colour, then a sort of a reddish colour. It really, really lived up to expectations in terms of that blood colour and that redness that we got.
Under fire.
Spread from top to bottom in 10 minutes flat.
And you heard explosions?
Yep. A few smaller ones first, and then a big kaboom.
And underwater.
1, 2, 3.
Speaking your language. Morning Report with Guy Aspinall and Susie Ferguson, weekdays from 6. Then on 9 to noon, Winter Olympics officials in Seoul contend with minus 25-degree temperatures and a roofless stadium ahead of the games starting next week. And after 10, reconnecting with the land and going bush with dock ranger and traditional Māori medicine expert Dr Rob Whitbourne. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Severe weather is affecting most regions today, and warnings and watches for heavy rain and severe gales are in force. Please keep up to date with the latest forecast for your region. So for all of the North Island, rain spreading from the west today with thunderstorms and possible downpours in the north and west. Rain easing to a few showers overnight or tomorrow morning. Northerly gales severe over central and southern areas, easing this evening. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland, rain or showers with heavy falls and thunderstorms in the west, easing in Marlborough and Nelson today and elsewhere tomorrow. Severe northerly gales easing later today. Canterbury, rain in South Canterbury becoming widespread this evening, then easing to a few showers tomorrow afternoon. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, rain with heavy falls, easing tonight, but becoming colder with snow above 900 metres, southeasterly gales turning southwest this evening and easing. The Chatham Islands fine today, rain developing tomorrow afternoon. It's 5:08.
Thanks, Katrina. Good evening, everyone. Have there been many weeks in recent years, even decades, of such pronounced climate extremes? Drought and heat waves have, in the space of just a few hours, given way to flooding, gale-force winds, tidal surges and temperatures reduced by half in some places. Local states of emergency have been declared in Buller and Dunedin. In Wellington, winds gusting up to 140 km have brought down trees, caused harbour ferries to be cancelled, some flights to be postponed or cancelled, and driven the swollen sea across the road in many places. In Auckland, a king tide, heavy rain and strong winds have also caused flooding and the obligatory traffic chaos, of course. In Taranaki, evacuations will be there shortly. In Nelson, high seas have done damage to roads and buildings, will be there shortly. Likewise in Westland, where hundreds of homes are without power, flooding has closed businesses and led to evacuations, will be there shortly. In Christchurch, the weathers remain stubbornly hot with strong winds and power being lost to almost 3,000 homes outside the city. Canterbury firefighters are battling 2 blazes as we go to air. Evacuations are being ordered in West Milton. We will update you on any major developments, obviously. Roads are closed in many places. The Met Service has issued multiple heavy rain warnings, as Katrina was just saying. Airports have been closed, flights cancelled or postponed. If you are in any areas where you need to tell us stuff that we haven't yet mentioned or aren't reporting on, please get in touch. Text us 2101 or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. And if you're wondering about Checkpoint, Dunedin, which this time last night was 34 degrees and facing a major wildfire, well, let's go there now live to the city's Civil Defence Controller, Sandy Graham. Good evening, Sandy. What a strange, mad 48 hours you guys are having. What's going on there now?
Well, luckily, John, things seem to be calming down. We're just waiting for a king tide at 5:17. But the rain has eased and we're hopeful that we've done the worst of it.
Oh, that's good news. Flooding in South Dunedin, some evacuations being talked about. Is that actually happening?
Yeah, it is, John. We've got police going door to door in areas of South D at the moment, just checking on the welfare of some of those folk because there's been a bit of sewage flowing through some properties there, and so we're just checking on those folk to check that they're okay and advise them of the plans that we have in place for them. And yes, stormwater and sewerage mixing in with floodwaters in a couple of places, right? Yeah, indeed. We had such a volume of rain that our system was functioning at full capacity, but there was just too much water. Yeah, just simply too much water. The rain and the king tides. A king tide about now, right? High tide, well, in the next few minutes. But you are sounding as if the situation is much less concerning than it was last king tide. Indeed, things are a lot better, but it has been a really challenging few hours because the situation changed literally almost every minute, it felt like, for a while. Yeah, I bet. But we were on deck, from 5 o'clock this morning, managing stuff. We put in place the best plans we could because we had good lead up to it. And good warnings, right? You knew it was coming. Yep, we did. And look, we've done this before. And we know we've got some areas that are affected in these type of situations that are low-lying. And so we had really good support from the community, from our emergency services. It's been, we've done it as best we can. Great. Sandy, are there areas people should avoid just before we move on? Absolutely. Well, look, rubberneckers should stay off the roads. To be honest, we've still got heaps of surface flooding in and around the city, so if people don't need to travel, they shouldn't. And then they should, just stay at home. Sandy Graham, Civil Defence Controller in Dunedin. We'll keep an eye on the king tide, but Sandy sounding reassuringly calm there, 5:13. The South Island's west coast has taken a hammering in the wild weather with power cut to thousands of homes. Schools and major highways closed and hundreds of people evacuated from parts of the Buller district where a state of emergency has also been declared. A king tide this morning caused flooding and prompted more than 100 people to be evacuated from homes in low-lying parts of Westport, the north of the region, of course, the Buller district's main town. The Buller District Mayor Gary Howard says many of those people will spend the night in evacuation centres in the town as they wait out another king tide to hit in the early hours of tomorrow morning.
Yeah, the flooding, because we've got one area of northern Westport that blew a sewer stormwater main, it's contaminated, so the flooding that has gone into some houses there is a serious issue. It's bad enough to have flood water, but it's even worse when you've got contamination. And so getting that cleaned up and assisting those people is paramount. But at the present stage, what we're trying to deal with is, preventing things that we may have to deal with in the hours of darkness, trying to get people out of those areas so we don't have those worries. And we've moved some people from the Buller Hospital to the O'Connor home, so that we're not having to deal with it if it was required in those hours of darkness.
It's Gary Howard, the Buller District Mayor. In other parts of the West Coast, power is out to roughly 6,500 properties. In Hokitika and south through the Westland District, it could take up to 48 hours before it's restored. The outages also closed down Westland milk products, Hokitika plant, with the company saying it's possible farmers who supply it may need to dispose of their milk on the farm. Greymouth CBD, a little further north, was closed today and people were told to stay home due to strong winds lashing the town. The main highway down the coast was also closed between Hokitika and Haas. That's a long stretch, as well as the stretch of the highway between Westport and Greymouth, stopping hundreds of tourists and other road users in their tracks. Our reporter Conan Young and video journalist Bex Parsons-King are on the West Coast. They've been cut off in hurry for much of the day, but we do hope to hear from them with their report and what they have seen shortly. In the meantime, as conditions got worse and worse, we called the Westland Region's Mayor, Bruce Smith, for an update. Now, Westland stretches south from Hokitika through Fox and Franz Joseph down to beyond Haas and Jackson Bay. Almost half the region's population lives in Hokitika, and that's where Mayor Smith was when he answered his cell phone out inspecting the damage.
Difficult at the moment, John. I'm down the Hokitika beach, and the sea at the moment is it's sorry about the noise, but it's crashing over here. We've got water. We've got driftwood the size of half a car being thrown and lifted up onto the beach. And hang on, I'm just getting blown out of here. This is a jolly nuisance, my friend.
A jolly nuisance? What? So what is it? Is it a tidal surge or is it the wind or both? What's going on? Is it a storm that's driving or is it a very unusually high tide?
Look, it's a combination. We've got a huge tide, probably the biggest one for the year. I've just come in from Canary visiting properties out there where there are hundreds of trees that have been smashed down. There's power lines down everywhere. The wind's sitting at the moment. I went up to the airport. The wind's sitting, hang on, just try and get out of the way there. Wind's sitting at around 70 or 80 knots at the present time. But we've got foam heading into our main street in Hokitika from the sea.
Wow, that's, for people who don't know the West Coast, that's a wee way back from the beach there, isn't it?
Well, we're about probably 100 metres or 150 metres from the beach. But we're just walking along towards Sunset Point, and what a bloody mess! It's terrible.
What are you talking? Is there property damage?
Oh yeah, we've got the sea, we've got driftwood. There's no way I can get to the back of the properties that overlook the beach here. And I've been walking down here for 40 years. I've never seen anything like this. This is just. There's a big wave. Hang on, oh, bugger, my feet are wet. That's my gumboots covered. Now that's still over your bed, John. Are you still there?
Yeah, I am. That wind is unbelievable. So how many properties are we talking about, Bruce? Is it right through that area along the Hokitika waterfront?
Well, the sea's coming over, and it's very hard to tell what the ultimate damage will be, but at this stage, I don't see a lot of properties inundated by the water. All the trees are coming down, the fences are coming down, and as I say, I'm standing here, and the waves are, like normally it's 5 metres there to the sea in front. I'm watching here at the moment, another one just right across in front of me. We've got one big clean-up coming for the next couple of days.
I just heard the word big clean-up. Are emergency services there? Are people being evacuated? What's going on? Have you got the services in?
The services are in. The fire brigades just along the beach right here at the moment, making sure that, because, you know, last thing we want is freedom camper to think this is normal and end up heading out towards Auckland. So, yeah, we've got the fire brigade out, all of the council CCO staff around. There are electronetters out trying to restore power, but I'm not sure, but I think it could be some time before it's.
So road closures, obviously, power down. You've lost power in that area.
We lost power at 11:47, and for the entire town and the districts. But it could be. We haven't had a report in yet from Fox, Harry, Friends. We've got no reports there yet how it's going down there. So, I guess that'll come through soon, hopefully. It is a nuisance, though, because we spend a lot of time looking after our seafront district, and nature delivers us a bit of a slapping just to remind us that she's in charge.
That's Bruce Smith, the Mayor of the Western region, talking to us earlier this afternoon. Let's go back to Christchurch now, where several fires are burning this evening. In West Melton, we've just spoken to Selwyn District Council's Welfare Officer, Douglas Marshall. Douglas says 50 people have been evacuated from 20 properties around West Melton. A welfare centre has been set up at the West Melton Community Hall. The fire is under control, but not contained. Police and fire will be patrolling the area overnight. We will report on any developments with those fires around Christchurch. Meanwhile, in Nelson, a huge storm surge combined with heavy winds damaging buildings along Wakefield Quay. Dozens of people were evacuated from homes in Mapua, Monaco, Collingwood and Ruby Bay. Some were taken to safety in inflatable boats. And Nelson Marlborough reporter Tracy Neal was out covering all of this, doing her usual fantastic job, and she had a lucky escape as a tree crashed through the parked car she was sitting in as she stopped to file a story.
The crash was absolutely phenomenal. I knew instantly what had happened because I heard the almighty crack of the tree trunk, and the next thing it was through the windscreen and crushed the roof and virtually crushed the car except for the part where I was sitting in the driver's seat. So I was lucky I was able to get the door open and get out, and I've got a few scrapes and bruises from doing that. I've got mud all over my clothes, I don't know how. And as feeling instantly silly and instantly blessed at the same time. It's just what happens.
So did the trunk just snap?
Yes, right at the roots. It snapped off at the roots of this massive tree, and that makes you sort of question a lot of things, doesn't it, John, about fate, why you were there at that moment and why you were saved. I mean, sadly, that poor woman, just a few weeks ago, the same thing happened and she died. And here I am. I just managed to somehow open the door and crawl out. I don't quite know how I did.
That's our Nelson Marlborough reporter Tracy Neal. You will be pleased to know she was given the all clear by a doctor this afternoon. A tree really did fall on her car as she was filing a story from inside it. Among the buildings on Nelson's waterfront who have suffered extensive water damage is one of the city's most loved citizens, really perched famously out over the sea. The 112-year-old boathouse building hosts weddings, functions, diners and the cafe, of course, and a buskers festival tonight, or at least it should have. None of that will be happening in the next few days. The building has survived, we're delighted to report, but the sea did its best to pull it apart. Amy Jo was working inside it as it happened.
So I was in the office and I could hear a little bit of movement out in the store, and I thought, somebody out there, a little bit more, and it was a little bit rumbling. I thought, no, it's actually probably the weather, and that kind of increased. Went out and the water had started coming up through the floorboards. So Ali's there by now, who is the manager. We've gone out into the storeroom, and rather than the water just coming up through the boards, it started to bump us, and we're kind of being forced up by the boards. And we've decided that's not that safe, and the chefs have been told to go home, and they've helped pack up, and we've all got out of there. We get outside and start noticing, while we're still in there, floorboards are being ripped up. We get outside, look in. Floorboards are being completely ripped up, the front deck's ripped up, the side deck's ripped up, and just a big mess.
Amy Jo from the boathouse, but it has survived. About 50 people who were evacuated in Nelson and Tasman today through that area. They're likely to spend the night in 3 evacuation centres in the region. Paul Shattuck of Nelson City Council told our producer Michelle Cook just before we came on air that the storm surges were the highest in living memory. He urged people to assess their properties as early as possible and to not drive along the coast unless they absolutely have to.
There are some roads that are still closed, especially out at the Glen and Monaco areas, which are closed to residents. They're available to residents only. There are a couple other road closures which are throughout the city. The main road, Rocks Road, State Highway 6, has just, as of about half an hour ago, reopened to all vehicles. It was closed, although it is closed to pedestrians, and we're recommending cyclists stay away from there. A lot of the structures, the footpaths and various platforms along Rocks Road need to be assessed by a structural engineer to determine whether they're safe or not, and we don't believe they are at the moment.
We're hearing from people in Hokitika that they have power back on in some areas, which is tremendous news. Power out to roughly 6,000 homes stretching south along the coast through Westland. We will update you on where power is returning. We'd love to hear from you if it is back in your area of Westland. Flights delayed and cancelled and diverted throughout the country. Obviously a lot of that in Wellington, also in Nelson, where, as we learnt, the tidal surge not only forced the airport to close, it damaged some airline buildings. Here's the airport CEO, Rob Evans.
The road into the airport was flooded from tidal surge from the creek that runs along next to it, and we couldn't safely get people in and out. So we had people held in the terminal that couldn't get out, and we had a lot of people on the outside of the airport not able to get in for about an hour. We've just recently reopened, though. The tides have now receded somewhat, and we managed to get the terminal open and the car parks open, and the airlines are just reviewing now flight operations, but hopefully they'll restart very shortly.
Have you ever seen anything like those surges before?
No, not at all. I mean, I've only been in Nelson 3 years, and we've seen a few events, but this is quite catastrophic. Actually, the New Zealand hangars and regional maintenance area is completely flooded, and that's a real mess over there. But there's a lot of clean-up to be done, but we're managing to get people in and out at the moment.
Rob Evans, CEO of Nelson Airport. Let's head a long way north from Nelson to Taranaki. The residents of about 30 properties at East Beach in Waitara are being asked to stay away from their homes ahead of the high tide at about midnight. Fire and emergency evacuated the Taranaki settlement shortly before midday as fears grew that a combination of this king tide and storm surges would inundate properties. Our Taranaki Whanganui reporter Robin Martin was on the ground at East Beach.
Waitara Fire Chief Dennis Crowe says fire and emergency were called in by concerned residents mid-morning, and soon after his staff went door to door advising people to get out. He says the situation was quite perilous.
Can you describe the situation around the corner?
Oh, it's very close. The sea's pounding right up very close to the towards the houses, and we're just making sure that nobody's in there if it does come through.
Mr. Crowe says he was particularly concerned about people being trapped in their homes during the night.
We're just looking at evacuating them over the next 2 high tides because this weather's going to be around for most of the night.
Waito Kurangi Tito and her husband Ray couldn't bring themselves to leave this morning.
Tell me what it's been like here this morning.
Absolutely scary, but not wanting to move from what's ours. We just wanted to stay put. People have been in and offered us places to go to, but somehow we just couldn't face leaving the house to the treacherous sea.
Mrs. Tito says the couple will move out tonight after watching the seas raging at the back fence over lunchtime. She fears being in the house overnight.
It's quite scary being on your own at night, and you lie in bed and you're listening to the rolling waves, and you think, well, last night I was up until 2 o'clock, and you think, is it going to come over the fence?
Joelle Rice was busy rescuing family heirlooms.
So what are you doing here?
So this is my grandmother's house. My cousins live here, and we're just here picking up all of her photos, and we're picking up her urn
because we don't want to come back and find the house ransacked or anything like that, and find that we can't have any of our photos, and so we're here picking up all of our sentimental things.
Waitara Community Board member Trevor Dudunsky reckoned the East Beach residents had been lucky.
We escaped a big bullet, and I mean a massive bullet. When I came down here around about 8:30, 9 o'clock this morning, the waves were as far as the eyes could see. I was concerned for all the safety of the residents along here.
Mr Dudunsky wants to see a seawall built at East Beach, a point echoed by Leo Carroll, who was helping residents safeguard their possessions.
The council needs to build up the wall along here, you know, and they need to do something about the groin, because even when it's not like this, the water's coming in and it's eroding all the side of the bank here, right next to the houses. So the council need to fix it. They stuffed it in the first place.
The New Plymouth District Council has a policy of only protecting significant public assets from storm surges and erosion. Some roads had to close ahead of the high tide, there were high wind warnings, and a tree had come down on a house. Powerco says at 4 p.m. about 500 homes were without power in Stratford, New Plymouth and Bell Block. Ina mutu mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Robin Martin tēnei.
From Taranaki to Wellington, where wild weather bringing winds of more than 140 km/h, cancelled flights, closed roads, threatened train lines and upended traffic lights. All sailings of the harbour ferry between Days Bay and Queen's Wharf have been cancelled and replaced by shuttle buses. At least 25 flights into and out of the city have been cancelled since 2 o'clock this afternoon, with the potential for more heading into this evening. We will update you on the situation at Wellington Airport. Auckland is preparing for another king tide to hit after the one this morning sparked commuter chaos. Traffic was at gridlock in large parts of the east and north of the city as waves buffeted by strong winds swamped roads, particularly a couple of main coastal routes into the city. Rowan Quinn reports.
The tide hit smack in the middle of rush hour, swamping Tamaki Drive, one of the main roads into the city from East Auckland. Its closure had a flow-on effect for many other parts of the east as drivers looked for another way into town. At Orake train station, tour guide Uli was waiting for a train after finding the waterfront blocked and exhausting all of the sneaky side roads he knew.
I live in Orake. For 40 years I have never seen anything like this. All the little side streets blocked. I knew my little shortcuts to get here. But I saw the only option, because I heard Shore Road is blocked, the only option to get by train to the city.
Traffic was at a standstill in many places and bus stops in the area were overflowing as people waited for buses that were never coming. Patricia's husband tried to get into town and had to turn around, taking half an hour to get home in what would normally be a 2-minute drive. She was frustrated by the lack of information in traffic reports.
We weren't getting that Keeper Road was totally gridlocked. We weren't getting that any of this area was gridlocked. All we were getting was that Tamaki Drive was closed.
Part of the northern motorway was flooded as well as Bucklands Beach, and traffic was extremely backed up to the north of the North Shore. Auckland Transport's Mark Hannon says it did all it could as a flooding hit.
In this situation, we really can't do much about it. It is nature. The alternative for people in that part of the town is to take the trains. They're not affected by the king tides at all, and the train lines do run through those suburbs.
He says preparations are being made for the next king tide, which is due to hit at about 9 o'clock tonight.
We'll have engineers on duty and road crews there. And if the king tide repeats what it did this morning, we'll be closing the road. We're expecting the worst of the situation to be around 8:30, 9 o'clock this evening.
Tomorrow's high tide's due slightly after rush hour at 9:30. Mr Hannon says the winds are predicted to blow the waves back towards the sea, but road closures are possible. I Tamaki Makoto, ko Rowan Quinn tēnei.
You are with Checkpoint on RNZ. Thank you for being with us. Coming up on the program, more weather plus the rest of the day's news. Big story. The government announces a Royal Commission into state abuse. The aftermath of Dunedin's Burnside fire seems extraordinary that was only burning last night when it was 34 degrees in Dunedin, and despite the clouds, some astronomers and stargazers were treated to a rare super blood moon combined with a total lunar eclipse overnight. Nona has business news coming up. We'd love your feedback, especially if you're in a place affected by the weather. You can text us on 2101. You know this, of course. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. We're on Facebook, Checkpoint with John Campbell, or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. 26 minutes to 6. Exactly. Here's Katrina with the headlines.
Up to 800 properties in Dunedin may have to be evacuated as flooding worsens in the city. A state of emergency has been declared and raw sewage is sweeping onto the streets in some areas. A state of emergency has also been declared in Buller, where people are being evacuated from low-lying areas near Westport. The Buller District Council says water is now starting to recede in some parts, though it continues to rise into areas north of Westport. In Nelson, 50 people have been evacuated from low-lying coastal areas and some roads are closed. Thousands of homes across Christchurch are without power as high winds topple trees and branches onto power lines. More than 2,800 customers are without power in Lincoln, West Melton, Taitapu, Akaroa and Littleton. A large out-of-control fire near West Melton in Canterbury has forced the evacuation of 10 houses. 16 fire trucks and 2 helicopters are at the scene fighting the fire, which is burning across paddocks near Whedon's Ross Road. A fire on Christchurch's Port Hills above Cass Bay is now under control. High winds are also battering the lower North Island, with more than 1,000 homes in Wellington, Taranaki and Wairarapa without power. Both Wellington and Taranaki saw wind gusts in excess of 130 kilometres an hour today. In Taranaki, people have been evacuated from beachfront homes in Waitara, where a king tide is expected at midnight. At least 24 flights in and out of the capital have been cancelled since midday, with several more delayed by hours. A 6-car pile-up on Wellington's southern motorway at Horokiwi is causing delays. Auckland Transport says it will have engineers on standby for tonight's high tide due at 9:30 and will close roads if it needs to. This morning's tide caused gridlock in large parts of the city after Tamaki Drive had to be closed. Several ferries operated by Fullers in the Auckland region have been cancelled or replaced by buses. That's due to the wild weather. Those are the headlines. I'm back at 6.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina. Let's turn to business news now with Nona Peltier, who's on the other side of me in the Auckland studio. Nona, there's been a strong growth in job ads.
Yes, there's a lot of demand for workers, like big time demand. So we're at the strongest rate of growth in more than 3 years. That was last month's numbers.
What's behind that?
Well, people are looking for workers in a number of sectors, the ones we've been talking about for a while.
Yep.
Building and service sectors. So what you'd expect, construction and tourism, right? That's what's driving that service sector. And, you know, it's kind of an interesting thing. And when you think about the service sector, one of the things that's really interesting from today was a consumer report from Market View, service sector. You think, well, what would that be? Restaurants, bars, and so on? Well, it turns out that millennials, and that's a group of people who are between the ages of 25 and 29, they make up about 9.6% of the workforce. Okay, right. So it's a large group of people. Yeah. Well, it turns out that they're spending a lot more of their money on cafes and bars, restaurants, that kind of thing, than past generations. So, yeah, so the service sector, it's not just being buoyed up there by tourists.
Gosh, that's fascinating. Where was
but
that
our
from?
workforce. This is a Market View report, which was really quite interesting, I thought. So they're spending more on a number of things. One of the things they love the most is convenience. So takeaways is a big popular item. And they're spending a lot more on those kinds of things than they are on clothing and the stuff that, you know, I remember my generation used to like to spend their money on. No, takeaways. There you go. So, yeah, I guess they're not eating at home, are they? No, and they're not saving for a house
They're
either.
not saving for a house because it just seems like such a remote and hopeless dream, I suspect, for many of them.
I guess so. So, yeah, so this generation, it said here, they've increased their spending by 56% over the past 8 years on those kinds of sort of having a good time. So, wow, eh? I know, it's so quite interesting. All right, so anyways, I suppose you want to know what happened on the market. Otherwise, there you go. Yeah, okay. So our index fell more than 2/3%. Not surprising after yesterday's big, huge gain. So that's a drop of 58 points versus yesterday's 143-point gain. We finished up at 8,384. Our dollar is steady at 73.7, which is pretty high, 91.5 cents Australian and 51.9 pence.
Nona Peltier, thank you very much indeed. The Royal Commission into State Abuse next, but before that, let's update the weather with Mid-Service meteorologist John Law. Kia ora, John.
Kia ora. Well, it has been a very busy weather day today, and there are still some severe weather warnings and watches in place as we go through towards Friday as well. But the good news is that things are improving. A few showers that still with us first thing through the far northern parts of the country. They'll clear off, and we are left with generally a drier and brighter afternoon. The winds now, though, more of a southwest, and that's going to be a real impact on our temperatures, not just across the North Island, but across New Zealand in general. Still a few showers around the far northern parts to start the day, but it should brighten up as we head through in towards the afternoon. A few showers that's to start the day through Wellington as well. It will clear off for a time, but another area of cloud and showers arrives in towards the afternoon. Temperatures, though, back into the 20s for many of us. Highest up in towards Gisborne, but a cloudy and grey start through there. Generally, though, those showers easing off as we head in towards the afternoon. For the South Island, it is a cloudy and wet start across Christchurch, and a cool feeling day as well. Temperatures back down to around about 9 or 10 degrees Celsius for Christchurch and struggling to the high teens. And it really is the story of the South Island. After that very wet and windy weather today, we'll find things are back into a southwester. Still some showers to watch out for as we go through the daytime, but also the return to those cooler temperatures. So for the likes of, say, Dunedin and Invercargill, back to highs around about 16 or 17 degrees Celsius, and our overnight lows back down into single figures. And that's it from me.
Thanks very much indeed, John. Lots of people contacting us about the traffic out of Wellington and Auckland in particular. We don't think that there are any particular events that are slowing you down to the point that it is driving many of you nuts. We just think it is the weather and the flooding and the tides. But we will keep an eye on it. It's heavy, heavy, heavy in Auckland and very slow getting out of Wellington. The stories of people who were abused in state care will be heard at the highest level of inquiry possible in New Zealand. The government has announced it will hold the Royal Commission chaired by the former Governor-General Sir Anjan Satyanand. It will cover all state institutions like child welfare home, borstalls and psychiatric hospitals, and will also include contracted out services. Here's our political reporter, May Heron.
In the words of the Prime Minister, the inquiry into historical abuse in state care is a chance to confront our history.
The fact it is a Royal Commission, the highest level of commission of inquiry that this government is able to establish, acknowledges two things: the independence and just the level of impact it's had on individuals' lives and their view of the state.
The Ministry for Children, Tracy Martin, says the inquiry is about people, not institutions.
If I can just give an example, if a young person was in our care and the state enrolled them into a Catholic boarding school, say, and they were harmed there, they are in scope.
This is how Jacinda Ardern phrased it.
We're the parent. If they experienced abuse and we, as the caregiver for that child, didn't know, didn't act, didn't make sure that we had checks in place to ensure the child was safe, we have to take responsibility regardless of who the perpetrator was.
The scope of the inquiry will cover 50 years from 1950 to the end of 1999, and unlike some similar overseas inquiries, it will include not just sexual, but physical and emotional abuse and neglect. These terms of reference will be put out for public consultation. The compensation process will also be investigated. Albi Aperi was just 13 when he ended up in state care at the Kohatiri Boys Training Centre in Levin. He was beaten, watched others get beaten, and abuse became a normal way of life.
It just made us violent people, and we're just starting to learn about violence and that it's not good. But when I was a little kid, I just found that I felt abandoned. Nobody there for me, and that's why I led the life that I led.
During the 1980s and 90s, there wasn't a year Albi wasn't in prison. He knows violence is wrong now, but he can't get out of the cycle he's trapped in. After 10 years of freedom, he slipped up. He's just come out of a 4-month jail stint 3 days ago.
It robbed us of our lives because we're the byproduct of them. They made us into what we were, And as we got older, we just went through their systems.
And what concern do you have about the next generation then, your kids? Are you concerned for them?
Definitely so, because that is the effects of mine. Because like a couple of my kids have been to jail. One of them's in there now. I've affected them in the way I've lived.
It's clear talking to Albie, his emotions are mixed. He's happy a royal commission may result in some accountability, possibly even an apology, but there is also so much ongoing pain that the trauma becomes immeasurable. This is even more evident with his twin brother Robert. He also went to Kohitiri.
I've only just recently, in the last year, been able to talk about it.
Robert hopes the inquiry will bring people some closure. Not that he's managed to find it yet.
We don't live normal lives. We're regarded as the rejects. We're the scum of the earth. You know, I heard it from a judge the other day telling us that, you know, for us to change our ways, maybe we need to look about leaving our gang situation. Well, what would we have after that? You blocked everything from the time we were kids right up to now. And it's not a nice feeling. Not nice to wake up when you're 50-something and really realising, you know, what have you actually done?
It's expected stories like Robert and Albie's will start coming before the inquiry in the middle of this year. The first year of the inquiry is expected to cost about $12 million, and the government hopes to have the final report back by the end of the parliamentary term. From Parliament for Checkpoint, May Heron.
This is a bizarre thing. It's 14 degrees in Dunedin as we speak. Last night at exactly this time it was double that, and we were covering a fire. People evacuated from a large industrial fire in Dunedin overnight feared their houses would be lost as embers set their backyards alight. The fire, which began at about 5 o'clock yesterday in Burnside, destroyed 3 industrial buildings and a timber yard. It's been contained well and truly. It's not entirely out though, despite the rain falling on the city. Our Otago Southland reporter Ian Telfer went to survey the damage.
About 100 homes in Burnside and Concord were evacuated as embers from the fire rained onto their properties, fanned by the hot winds. Returning this morning in the rain, the smell of smoke still strongly in the air, residents told of their close encounters with the fire. Daniel Donaldson says his Morton Street rental property was saved just in time.
I think at about 6:30 is when I heard the crackling in my backyard, and that's when the fire started. And so my neighbour and I, we were just about to get out. We're like, we're going to go now. So we started leaving, and then that's when the fire guys showed up at the fire. I think they stepped out of nowhere. I have no idea how they got to my property because it's up a hill and it's a bit hard to get to from down here. I thought, there's no way someone's going to get to this fire before it gets out of control, but they were just there. They just stepped out of the ether, and they put it out. It was really good. So we just doused it with hoses, and then the cops turned up and said we had to go.
Another resident, Judy Walters, who lives on the other side of the motorway, described the fire as very scary. She says the area has been very dry, and when the blaze started to spread, it looked like a scene from a war movie.
Oh, it's shocking, shocking. It was enormous. You've no idea the flames. I've never seen it, only on the movies when you see a war picture or something and you see all the flames.
Thelma Littlejohn showed me around what remained of her greenhouse, which had melted.
This has been on fire in here. Yeah.
Oh, for goodness sake, your tomato greenhouse has been melted.
Yes, my chilies and
One
tomatoes.
side of it is just completely open now because of what the plastic's just melted away.
Yeah, my son phoned me and said, for goodness sake, Mum, get out there and start damping things down, because he said that he was coming down the motorway and he said there's big embers landing on the motorway.
But across the motorway at the scene of the fire, the situation is much worse. Some businesses have lost almost everything. The manager of Green Waste, Mo Niku, says he was working at his office at 5 o'clock when he saw smoke and rang 111. He says firefighters arrived and told him to get out immediately.
I left office. I came outside in the street looking while the fire was engulfing the whole area. And all the trees, they were on fire. And while between me and the fire was about, I would say very easily, 400-meter distance, all of a sudden I felt fire on my face. I turned back and I saw the fire is on the yard below us, which is another firewood selling huge yard below us. The whole thing went on fire.
The firm's owner, Bob Gillanders, says nothing except the timber office is still standing.
Absolute desolation. It's like something out of a war, a war scene. You know, it's just 3 buildings which are skeletons, concrete, bricks, and rubbish, and yeah.
Bob Gillanders says he's sitting, looking at the rain, and wondering what on earth to do next. In Dunedin for Checkpoint, Ian Telfer.
And Ian is still out and about as heavy rain has deluged parts of Dunedin, leading to a state of emergency in the city and some evacuations. We did hear from the Civil Defence Controller at the beginning of the program that it isn't as bad as people had feared. Ian's going to update us on the latest. We will hear more from Ian after 6. Well, the high-profile equal pay dispute at Britain's public broadcaster moved to Parliament today. It follows the resignation of the BBC's China editor, Carrie Gracie, who was being paid much less than male editors in similar roles. She appeared in front of a parliamentary committee looking into the matter, where she didn't pull any punches at all. The BBC's media correspondent Amal Rajan has this report.
Several of the most high-profile female presenters on BBC News were in Westminster today to support their colleague Carrie Gracie.
Do the BBC need to do more on equal pay for women? That's why we're here.
Look into the middle, everyone, please. To the middle.
I was appointed China editor at the end of 20.
She resigned her post as China editor in protest at unequal pay. In blistering testimony to a select committee of MPs, she accused the BBC of institutionalised discrimination when it had paid her less than other international editors.
We knew there was inequality. We didn't know the details because the BBC is extremely secretive on pay, but we knew we were underpaid, and I was determined at this point where I knew I'd give the China job every last ounce of my skill and stamina. I knew I would do that job at least as well as any man.
The corporation's dealing with her grievance was, she said, insultingly shambolic, and she added that she'd be declining nearly £100,000 in back pay.
I have said I don't want that money. That's not what it's about for me. I feel my salary is a good salary, it's public money. That's not what it was about. They're still not giving me equality.
And in a concerted attack against BBC management, she said that for years it had created a fortress to keep out ordinary staff.
I was so distraught by what had happened. Anyway, then I thought, no, I have to fight.
Gracie's grilling went on for 2.5 hours. When said management emerged in the afternoon, the Director General apologised for the situation.
I'm sorry, it went to a grievance, and I said up front at the beginning I'd very much like to resolve the case of Carrie Gracie with her. And I'm sorry this has taken so long, and I'm sorry within this position, yes.
He went on to explain for the first time in public why the BBC believe there is a hierarchy of roles among correspondents.
The idea that every single editor, home and abroad I would imagine, should be paid exactly the same, I don't agree with. It should not be a matter of gender. Completely agree. Outrageous if it was. But you know, you have balances between different editors, and we need to be very upfront about what that, as it were, pecking order is.
The BBC has a clear plan and is largely ahead of the industry on gender inequality. But Carrie Gracie's case remains far from resolved or unique.
Marajan reporting there from London for the BBC. In what's now being described as the worst epidemic of sexual abuse in the history of sport, prosecutors have identified more victims of the former USA Gymnastics doctor Larry Nassar, bringing the total now to 265. Of course, last week Nassar was sentenced to up to 175 years in prison after 160 young women, some of them top stars in the sport, some of them children when they had been abused, testified against him. He's been facing another sentencing hearing where 65 women are expected to give evidence. The entire board of USA Gymnastics has now resigned in the wake of the scandal. The ABC's Catherine Gregory has this report.
Former US Gymnastics team doctor Larry Nassar has faced another sentencing hearing where victims again detailed their harrowing experiences, this time during his time at an elite Michigan gymnastics club. 17-year-old Jessica Thomashow is one of those women victims.
Larry Nassar is evil. He first molested me when I was 9.
when I was in 5th grade, before I had braces and when I still played with my American Girl dolls.
She's one of 265 people who have now come forward with allegations against the former team doctor. Nasser has already been sentenced to between 40 and 175 years in prison as a result of a separate case. Jessica Thomashow again.
He created the physical and emotional pain that comes with sexual trauma, pain that I have to this day.
Catherine Ebert says she's also a victim of Nasser.
I hope you realize that you will never have any power over anybody for the rest of your life. Because standing in this courtroom today and having my voice heard is a huge step in my personal healing process, and I know that my story will help to prevent this from ever happening again. Because it won't. It can't.
Judge Janice Cunningham has put aside several more days to hear from more than 60 women and girls who want to confront Nasser or read their statements in court.
We have over 265 identified victims and an infinite number of victims in this state, in the country, and all over the world. As a result, by allowing live streaming and tweeting.
The practice of allowing accusers to speak even if they're not directly tied to a case has raised questions about fairness. But other lawyers have praised Judge Cunningham's treatment of the victims. The saga has rocked US Gymnastics. Its entire board has resigned after the United States Olympic Committee threatened to strip the body of its power. And in Washington, D.C., legislation has passed the Senate which requires governing bodies of amateur athletics to report abuse claims promptly. Democrat Senator Dianne Feinstein supported the bill.
We talked about what happened to them and how USA Gymnastics and the adults charged with protecting them failed at every single turn.
The new law means failure to report an abuse allegation to law enforcement could result in 1 year in prison.
It's exactly 5 minutes to 6. That was Catherine Gregory from the ABC. Lucky astronomers and stargazers across the country were treated to a rare super blood moon combined with a total lunar eclipse overnight. Despite cloudy conditions in some places, many were still able to witness the triple celestian phenomenon. Katie Scotcher reports.
Between 1 and 4 this morning, space enthusiasts across the country eagerly tried to spot the rare super blood moon, the first time since 1982. Those who managed to catch a glimpse saw a moon that was 14% brighter and 30% larger than usual, with a reddish auburn tint. President of the New Zealand Astronomical Society, John Drummond, was one of the lucky ones. He has 5 observatories set up at his Gisborne home and watched the event from one of them.
I had a few telescopes automatically taking photos last night while I was also physically taking photos and sitting in. I've got a deck chair in one observatory, a lazy boy. I was just sitting in the lazy boy with binoculars also, just gazing at the moon.
He says the view was beautiful.
The moon was just this beautiful red orb in the sky, a really stunning thing. I was thinking about how people in the past must have just really freaked out when they saw the moon disappear and sitting there as a red orb in the sky.
John Drummond wasn't the only one who managed to spot the moon. It was also visible from the west coast of the United States and Canada, across the Pacific Ocean to Australia and China. Piha woman Cindy Baxter was another keen supermoon spotter, who watched the eclipse using binoculars from the comfort of her bed.
I was expecting it to be rainy and stuff, and the rain was just finishing, and then I just looked up and there was this beautiful orange orb. It was like it was a ball rather than just sort of the flat moon. It was absolutely beautiful, and I just had a perfect view of it for the next hour, I suppose. Then the clouds came in.
But many New Zealanders weren't as lucky as John and Cindy. Paraparaumu woman Fern Campbell got up early, but could only see thick cloud. She says she's tried to spot supermoons and meteor showers before, but had no such luck.
We've actually tried to see the last 2 supermoons. We saw one of them, and then the other one, I think we were sick and couldn't go out walking that night. And we also tried for the meteor showers earlier in the month.
South Island skies were also covered in thick cloud. Mount John Observatory in Tekapo was open for space enthusiasts to watch the eclipse. But guide Claire O'Connor says due to bad weather, they had to live stream the event from NASA's website. She says they were able to catch small glimpses of the supermoon.
There's maybe some thin clouds just passing over quickly and you get a glimpse and it's like, oh, quite possibly the worst conditions, because then it just started pouring down. Right when we saw on the live stream, there was totality. We went outside and it was absolutely pouring down.
But space enthusiasts and astronomers who missed out this time shouldn't despair. Another supermoon is expected to take the skies in 2021. For Checkpoint, Katie Scotcher.
It's 2 minutes to 6. Lots to update, and we're going to do so after 6. We're keeping an eye on that fire in West Milton, which is in Canterbury, just outside Christchurch. There are choppers in the air and obviously firefighters on the ground there. Authorities have evacuated, we think, somewhere between 10 and 20 homes. It looks like they are fighting a winning battle against that fire. It's very hot still in Christchurch, somewhat perversely, because the rest of the country seems to have switched off the heater and there are strong winds fanning the blazes. But it sounds like emergency services are doing good work there, touch wood. After the news, we're going to go to Harihari, where our reporter Conan Young and our camerawoman Bex Parsons-King have spent the day. They've struggled to get their report out because there is no power and no internet there, but we are somehow able to get in touch with them. We're also going to update the latest from Dunedin with our reporter Ian Telfer. Last night Ian was covering the fire. Tonight he is covering the floods. It all seems vaguely apocalyptic. People are saying, why don't you link it to global warming? Actually, we've been doing quite a lot of that lately, and we did a fantastic interview with Judy Lawrence last week, and Judy Lawrence said, look, this is absolutely climate change, and one of the features of climate change is weather extremes, and we will see more of this. We had Andrew Tate on from Niwa last night saying we are going to see more of this. Droughts followed by heavy rainfall, and heavy rainfall on hard, dry ground causes flooding. So we have indeed been discussing the fact that we will see greater frequency of climatic extremes as we have seen over the past week, and we will see them in areas not accustomed to things like drought. Andrew Tate last night used the example of the West Coast. Speaking of the West Coast, people in Hokitika are contacting us and saying good work by the local power company. Power is coming back on in the town south of there, further south along Westland, still power out for hundreds of homes. It's coming up to 6 o'clock on Checkpoint.
RNZ News at 6. Kia ora, good evening. Ko Katrina Batanaho. Dunedin's mayor says the city's stormwater network has not been able to cope with the volume of water that fell on the city today. About 40 millimetres of rain fell on Dunedin this afternoon, which has overwhelmed the water network and forced sewage to flow onto some streets in the city's south. A state of emergency was declared this afternoon. Dunedin's Mayor Dave Cull says there's now significant flooding in areas across Dunedin, particularly in South Dunedin and Mosgiel. Mr Cull says the water network is not coping due to the sheer amount of water that's fallen on the city.
It's been a bit tricky just knowing what was coming because the forecast naturally is never dead right, so pretty fickle forecasting. But we have had 80 mil of water, of rain per hour for 2 hours, and that is more than our system can cope with, even though it is operated exactly how it is intended.
Dunedin's Mayor Dave Cull. Hokitika-based Westland Milk says suppliers may have to dump milk due to the West Coast power outage. A spokesperson says suppliers were told this afternoon that the milk collection schedule had been severely affected. The spokesperson says the plant will be able to start processing again when power is restored, which may not happen until Saturday. Westland Milk is trying to get tankers to as many farms as possible, but is taking the milk to other dairy processors to be treated. A Nelson resident says the boat shed and boat house on the city's waterfront have been decimated in today's storm. The king tide and rain has caused flooding, felled trees and forced evacuation in low-lying areas. Resident Pete Rainey says the northerly swell has caused a lot of damage to buildings on the waterfront.
The boat house itself has had all of its floors punched right out, and the approaches to the building have been washed out to sea. So it's sad to see the building in such a state, but the floor's been wiped out, so to speak, and there's a lot of damage.
Nelson resident Pete Rainey. Auckland Transport is putting plans in place for tonight's king tide after this morning's caused gridlock in large parts of the city. Tamaki Drive had to be closed and the flow-on effect meant traffic was at a standstill in much of the east. There was also flooding on the northern motorway. Auckland Transport says it will have engineers on standby for tonight's high tide due at 9:30 and will close roads if it needs to. Tomorrow morning's king tide is due at 9:30, but the winds that exacerbated today's problems are not forecast. A large out-of-control fire near West Milton and Canterbury has forced the evacuation of 10 houses. A fire and emergency spokesperson says the fire is burning across paddocks near Whedon's Ross Road. 16 fire trucks and 2 helicopters are at the scene fighting the fire. The spokesperson says although no homes are in immediate danger, 10 houses on Jack's Drive have been evacuated as a precaution. Scientists in Japan and Australia say they've made significant progress towards developing an early blood test for Alzheimer's disease, the most common form of dementia. The new technique looks for a toxic protein called amyloid beta that's associated with the condition. The BBC's James Gallagher reports.
The new approach, reported in the journal Nature, looks for fragments of amyloid that end up in the bloodstream. Trials on nearly 400 people show it's more than 90% accurate. Significantly, the study shows it is possible to look in the blood to see what's happening in the brain. The researchers say their approach could, in the future, become a blood test for Alzheimer's. However, there are still hurdles to overcome, including proving it works in much larger trials.
James Gallagher reporting. The Canterbury District Health Board has issued a measles warning after a man who attended Christchurch Hospital's emergency department has been confirmed as having the virus. The DHB says the 30-year-old was in the emergency department on Sunday afternoon. It says measles spreads easily and people who were in the emergency department after 1 p.m. on Sunday should phone their doctor if they're concerned. St Stephen's School in Auckland is set to reopen at the start of 2020, almost 20 years after its doors were closed. The Māori boys' boarding school first opened in 1844, but closed in 2000 due to financial and performance issues. Former Old Boy Taranaki Kingi says the school could reopen at its former Bombay site or in South Auckland. Taranaki Kingi says there's excitement around the future of the school.
We do not want to revisit the past. We want to create a new school, a modern school, which meets the contemporary needs and expectations of our rangatahi.
Former student Taranaki Kingi. It's 6:05. Sport, and the All Black Sevens have avoided a difficult first-up assignment against Australia, Fiji or South Africa in the opening rounds of the Commonwealth Games. The 4 pools for the April tournament were announced today, with New Zealand grouped with Kenya, Canada and Zambia in pool play. The pool winners will advance to the semi-finals and play off for medals. In the women's draw, New Zealand will play Canada, South Africa and Kenya in pool play. The entire board of USA Gymnastics has now resigned following revelations that the long-time team doctor sexually abused numerous athletes under his care. The US Olympic Committee had threatened to revoke the organisation's governing authority if the full board didn't step down following the sentencing of former team doctor Larry Nassar to up to 175 years in prison after he pleaded guilty to sexual assault charges. Formula One has announced it will stop using so-called grid girls from the start of the season. The BBC's Alex Capstick reports.
Women, known as grid girls, often scantily clad, have been a feature of Grand Prix weekend for decades. But a statement from Formula One said the custom is clearly at odds with modern-day societal norms. Last week, darts, under pressure from broadcasters, stopped the practice of models escorting players onto the stage during events. But cycling and boxing, where females are employed in glamorous roles, have so far resisted calls for change.
Alex Capstick reporting. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Lisa Olsen-Brown from Gisborne's Waikirikiri School on using Mandarin classes to help students learn te reo, and vice versa. There's a BBC report on people who lose their ability to smell and taste, which will go nicely with an hour-changing world investigation into using the smell of native birds to put the stoats off for scent. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Severe weather is affecting most regions today and warnings and watches for heavy rain and severe gales are in force. Please keep up to date with the latest forecast for your region. For all of the North Island, rain spreading from the west today with thunderstorms and possible downpours in the north and west. Rain easing to a few showers overnight or tomorrow morning. Northerly gales severe over central and southern areas easing this evening. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller and Westland, rain or showers with heavy falls and thunderstorms in the west, easing in Marlborough and Nelson today and elsewhere tomorrow, severe northerly gales easing later today. Canterbury, rain in South Canterbury becoming widespread this evening, then easing to a few showers tomorrow afternoon. Otago, Southland and Fiordland, rain with heavy falls easing tonight but becoming colder with snow above 900 metres, southeasterly gales turning to southwest this evening and easing. And for the Chatham Islands, fine today, rain developing tomorrow afternoon. It's 8 minutes past 6 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. Floodwaters do appear to be receding in Dunedin after the city was hit by torrential rain. Many schools closed early and a state of emergency was declared there, in part to help facilitate evacuation should there have to be some heavy rain, but not heavy enough, although, boy, the water infrastructure, horizontal infrastructure, has struggled to cope in some places. Sewerage infrastructure not working, sewage with stormwater in the floodwater in some places. Our reporter Ian Telfer is in St Kilda and joins us now via live view. Hi Ian, it's actually looking over your shoulder not too bad.
Yeah, John, this did not look good earlier this afternoon. As you said, this looked like it was going to be a repeat of the June 2015 flood, which flooded 1,200 properties in this area, but it seemed to have dodged a bullet here. As you can see, there's sandbags behind me, and there's also a lot of sand, and there's no one here. People have come, they've gone, apparently 60 or 70 sandbags were given out, but this is not the full-scale emergency that we've had before because the waters have now gone down, the rain has stopped. I think it's almost entirely stopped now, and it does appear that the floodwaters have gone away.
Well, that's tremendous news. So fears of evacuations, I know there was a retirement home where people were being evacuated, or where it certainly was being contemplated. All of that stopped as well?
It does seem so. I went past that rest home, which was the Radius Fulton one up on Hillside Road in South Dunedin. That was badly hit in 2015. Apparently there were some partial evacuations there this afternoon, but not a full-scale emergency. They do have water, and they had water up to their door and maybe inside, but I think that that hasn't been as bad as was feared. And for the rest of South Dunedin, well, I drove around in the last hour, and there were a lot of places where there'd clearly been water. Some streets that were blocked off. There was also some debris around the place, but the water's almost all gone now, and there was no sign of a big clean-up needed. So I think at this stage, John, things are going to be okay.
Ian, what a nutty 24 hours. It looks like someone's arrived to collect some sandbags behind you, but what a nutty 24 hours. This time last night you were racing to cover the fire in Burnside. It was over 30 degrees. Tonight you are covering flooding and it is less than half that.
Can you believe that Dunedin has gone from drought through a fire and now through a flood? It is quite incredible, isn't it?
Yeah,
people make the normal jokes about a plague of locusts, but it has been a really trying time for a lot of people, and that fire was really quite scary for the community down there. A lot of the city affected, and now to be suddenly thrown into half the temperature, strong cold winds, rain, in every direction, and the threat of serious flooding. It's been a trying week, and I think people will breathe a real sigh of relief after this week is over.
Well, thank you for doing your brilliant job covering it. Ian Telfer live from a sandbagging facility where not much sandbagging is required, mercifully. It's 11 minutes past 6. The wild weather that has been pounding the South Island today left large parts of the West Coast cut off and without power. One such town was Harihari, roughly an hour's drive south of Hokitika. We were there earlier, of course, where our reporter Conan Young and visual journalist Rebecca Parsons-King were trapped this afternoon, along with about 100 locals. And tourists too, of course, this time of year. Conan, I think, joins us now from Rossi. There, Conan?
Yeah, that's right. How you doing, John?
Oh, yeah, good. Well, I haven't had the day you've had, bro. What have you seen? What's the latest?
Yeah, well, look, I can tell you, as far as Harihari is concerned, the road north from the town reopened at 4 this afternoon. That's why we're in Ross now, just north of Harihari. However, for those wanting to head south towards the glaciers, a lot of those tourists, the last I heard, the highway was likely to remain closed overnight. Now, that's due to the sheer number of trees and power lines that are down and blocking the road. Fortunately for the good folk of Hari Hari, the power came back on at 2:30 this afternoon, so some good news for them. This was also a massive relief for some of the farmers, the dairy farmers in that neck of the woods, who rely on electricity to power their milking sheds. No power would have meant no milking, which could have seriously affected their cows, which all need to be milked at least once a day. We spoke to one of these farmers, Murray Wyatt, and he's farmed near Hari Hari his whole life, and he says he's never seen winds as strong as the ones he saw today.
These trees, that was, in the old days, it was called the cooing tree. When the guys were out felling and clearing the land, they used to go there at lunchtime and cooey out. That's how it got its name.
Wow. And so you lost a shed there as well. There's a bit of metal sort of tin strewn over your fields there.
Yeah, it's just got worse and worse, and didn't really expect it this fierce, but we've lost a lot of trees and sheds, and it'll take a bit of cleaning up, but you've got to keep going. It's,
what was it like at the peak of the winds there?
Frightening, yeah. Frightened to go outside because of the sheets of iron flying around, and we don't often get on the west coast big strong winds like this.
As we drove south from Hari Hari towards Franz Joseph and the Waiho River, which we'd heard stood a chance of bursting its banks, the force of the storm became quickly apparent.
Hey John, I'm standing here just outside of Hari Hari on the west coast. I thought I'd get out of the car and just give you an idea just of how strong this wind is. The rain is actually coming at me sideways, and it feels like hail just because it's been blowing so fast. We're going to drive a bit further up the road. We've come across a few trees and things on the road, but yeah, this wind is just, I have never ever experienced anything like this. This is intense.
After negotiating our way around numerous downed trees, we thought we'd finally met our match. We've got a bunch of, it looks like tourist travellers on the other side of the road. They can't come this way and we can't go that way. I'm just looking up at some other trees that were growing next to this one, and they're pretty close to coming down. I don't want to actually stand here too long, but the rain is really coming down here. The wind not quite as strong as the exposed place we were in just before. But the rain really pouring down. The wind obviously strong enough to bring down a tree like this. I'm not sure what's going to happen now. I guess we'll have to wait for roading contractors maybe to come through and clear this tree. I think it's a little bit big for. These people are trying to move it. Okay, here we go. I was just going to say it looks a little bit too big for anybody to move, but these guys are going to give it a crack. I might actually go and give them a hand. A group of fellow travellers stuck on either side of the tree struggled for 20 minutes to pull enough of the tree to one side to allow us to reopen at least one lane. No waiting for the authorities to turn up and do the job for us. In this case, people power was enough to get the job done and allow all of us to continue on our journey. Later, when we were all safely back in civilization, Hills Balkanendi Edelman and Sander Balkanendi said they were impressed with the display of teamwork.
That was crazy. I think with about 40 people, and then in the end, when
the
tree was off the road, everyone was like, "New Zealand, New Zealand!" Yeah. So cool. Yeah. So we actually felt really part of the. People really said we're doing this for the country.
Fellow traveller Dave said this wasn't the only tree that had to move along the way.
Who kept stopping at each tree and then using a team of maybe 15 or 20 people to pull each tree out of the way. It was it was a good demonstration of teamwork, really.
Everybody spoken to was just a little bit terrified by the conditions.
There was just one point where we got out to move a tree, and then there was some more cracking coming from the other trees around us. And I said to the lads that if one goes, to just dive into the ditch, because then the tree would fall on the road and we'd be all right. But other than that, I think we all found it quite exciting.
Crazy weather. Really, you saw the wind blowing over the street, and our little van We nearly blew off a couple of times.
I frightened because we were driving through the woods and the trees are very, very high and trees on both sides, and I was afraid of we got a tree in our car. So, yes, I didn't like it. It was very scaring, I think.
So there you go, John. It's been quite a day for everybody on the road. As for our farmer, Murray Wyatt, you saw at the start of that piece, in the last hour we heard he finally has his power back on and can begin milking those 500 cows of his, so some good news there.
Thanks so much, Conan. Fantastic work by you and our camerawoman and editor, Bex Parsons-King. For people who were listening to that package but didn't see it, we'll put it up online. Some lovely storytelling and great pictures from the West Coast. Elsewhere, roads were flooded and schools closed early as the king tide combined with high winds, bringing flooding to coastal areas. Really severe flooding and road damage in the Nelson region. Flights were cancelled at airports around the country. A state of emergency has also been declared in the Buller district. That's as well as the one in Dunedin. Here's Zach Fleming.
More than 100 people are getting ready to spend the night at an evacuation centre in Westport and Buller as the town waits for another king tide to hit early tomorrow morning. District Mayor Gary Howard says all precautions are being taken, including moving some people out of Buller Hospital.
So that we're not having to deal with it if it was required in those hours of darkness.
But even if the district does get through the next tide unharmed, it's facing a big clean-up.
We've got one area of northern Westport that blew a sewer stormwater main. It's contaminated, so the flooding that has gone into some houses there is a serious issue. It's bad enough to have floodwater, but it's even worse when you've got contamination.
At other parts of the West Coast, at least 6,000 homes are without power and are expected to remain without power until Saturday. Schools and major highways are also closed. Greymouth's CBD was closed. The main highway down the coast was also closed between Hokitika to Haast, as well as the stretch of the highway between Westport and Greymouth, stopping hundreds of tourists and other road users in their tracks. In Hokitika, sea foam was flowing down the main street, which is around 100 metres away from the beach.
I've been walking down here for 40 years. I've never seen anything like this.
Westland Mayor Bruce Smith was out inspecting the damage this afternoon.
We've got driftwood the size of half a car being thrown and lifted up onto the beach. And we've got a huge tide, probably the biggest one for the year. I've just come in from Canary visiting properties out there where there are hundreds of trees that have been smashed down. There's power lines down everywhere.
Further north in Nelson, roads have also been forced closed, and around 50 people are likely to be sleeping in evacuation centres until Sunday, after what one councillor described as the highest storm surges in living memory.
A lot of the structures, the footpaths and various platforms along Rocks Road need to be assessed by a structural engineer to determine whether they're safe or not. And we don't believe they are at the moment.
The city's iconic 112-year-old Boathouse Cafe suffered extensive damage. Staff had to run outside as the storm surge nearly pulled the building apart.
While we're still in there, floorboards are being ripped out. We get outside, look in, floorboards are being completely ripped up, the front deck's ripped up, the side deck's ripped up.
In Waitara, just north of New Plymouth, 30 properties at East Beach have been evacuated as a precaution ahead of tonight's high tide. Waitara Fire Chief Dennis Crowe says otherwise people could be trapped in their homes during the night.
The sea's pounding right up very close to towards the houses, and we're just making sure that nobody's in there if it does come through.
Locals expressed anger there isn't a sea wall to protect them, but were for the most part more than happy to leave, as like Waito Kurangi Tito, they feared the worst.
It's quite scary being on your own at night, and you lie in bed and you're listening to the rolling waves, and you think, well, last night I was up until 2 o'clock, and you think, is it going to come over the fence?
Roads have also been closed in Waitara ahead of the high tide, and around 500 homes are without power in Stratford, New Plymouth and Bell Block. The North Island's main cities escaped unscathed, the storm not packing quite the same punch. Though in Wellington, winds gusting up to 140 kilometres an hour brought down trees and caused harbour ferries and more than a dozen flights to be cancelled. Further north in Auckland, again, not as bad, no power cuts or states of emergency, But Tamaki Drive along the waterfront flooded for the second time this year, forcing the main arterial route to be closed during the morning rush hour from 7 a.m. till 11 a.m, causing traffic chaos. Ōrākei local Uli gave up trying to drive and went to the train station.
For 40 years I have never seen anything like this. All the little side streets blocked. I knew my little shortcuts to get here. But I saw the only option, because I heard Shore Road is blocked, the only option to get by train to the city.
And there may be a repeat tonight, according to Auckland Transport spokesperson Mark Cannon.
We'll have engineers on duty and road crews there. And if the king tide repeats what it did this morning, we'll be closing the road. We're expecting the worst of the situation to be around 8:30, 9 o'clock this evening.
And it more than likely won't be the last time either. The road regularly floods in a king tide. Auckland Transport announced remedial work in September last year, but that's not expected to be finished until the start of 2019. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
Yeah, high tide this evening, 7 o'clock in Auckland. Obviously, RNZ News will keep an eye on what's happening to that road. And throughout the country during the evening, speaking of what's happening, this is a big story in Christchurch. A large out-of-control fire near Westland and Canterbury has forced the evacuation of about 50 people from 20 properties. A fire and emergency spokesperson says the fire, which started in a hedge about 3 o'clock this afternoon, is burning across paddocks near Whedon's Ross Road. 5 helicopters and 19 appliances and tankers battling the blaze over 2 to 3 hectares of land. St John Ambulance has taken 3 people to hospital. 1 is in a serious condition after inhaling smoke. The public are really being urged to take care because a wind change is expected at 9 p.m, which will see smoke blow in a southwesterly direction away from West Melton. An evacuation centre has been set up at West Melton Community Centre. Please don't drive on those roads and go and have a sticky beak. They need to be able to get fire engines and ambulances, if required, in and out. It is, of course, a year next month since those Port Hills fires. It's been very dry and very hot, and a pretty good wind in Christchurch today too. 5 helicopters and 19 appliances are currently battling that blaze. Obviously, we'll update you throughout the night here on RNZ. Speaking of updates, with the time at 24.5 let's look at the roads throughout the country. There are a few closures. Neil Walker from NZTA is joining us live on the phone. Neil, are you there?
Yeah, I am.
Nice to talk to you. Where are you this evening?
I'm in Wellington.
And how can we have a Welly traffic report? How's it getting out of town if you're heading home from Wellington City towards the Hutt Valley or the Kapiti Coast or Porirua? What's the traffic like as you leave the central city?
Oh, it's a bit slow heading up the coast tonight. I think we've had particularly around Pukerua Bay, and I think partly to do if we had some train issues earlier on. So I think there's a lot more people on the road, but the weather's not great either. So There's a lot of rain and wind. So a bit longer than what people would normally expect to travel up the coast road tonight.
Okay, thank you. So patience required. Yeah, we had a listener text us saying that the rain was so loud on her roof at Kapiti Coast that she couldn't actually hear us on the radio. Is it really torrential rain still there, or has it died down a bit?
Oh, it's died down a bit. I know I was travelling up to Johnsonville around 4 o'clock, and it was pretty hard to see where you're going at that time. So it's been fairly wet, but we've been talking to Met Service about what to sort of expect over the next 12 hours. So I think you're going to see this front move across from southeast. So predicting that the wind and some of the rain is going to sort of come right overnight. So, but it's certainly having an impact, and I think the winds are going to be around for a while. I know you would have experienced some up in Auckland.
Yeah, we have. Yeah, it's been a buffy all day.
Yeah. And I think there's a combination of winds, high tides, is what's causing a lot of the problems on the roads at the moment. So. I think I just heard somebody talking about Tamaki Drive.
Yeah, that's right. High tide at 7, I think, in Auckland. Yeah. What's going on at Tamaki?
Yeah, look, well, I'm not sure if it's 7 or 9. I mean,
sorry.
I heard 9 earlier on.
Yeah.
But generally, I think it's a combination once again of high tides. And it's just a matter of keeping an eye on that road. I think people just need to be aware of it around 9 tonight and also 9 in the morning. And
best avoided, really, if you want to avoid that commuter traffic backup. What are the major roads we're looking at that are closed? Have you got an update on State Highway 6, which is south of Hokitika, heading down the coast, of course, to Haast, and then you go inland to Wanaka and Queenstown? What's happened with State Highway 6?
So State Highway 6 is closed south of Hokitika from Ross all the way through to Makarora. So it's and the reason for that same issue actually. So king tides combined with high winds, and it's brought a lot of trees down on that road. So right at the moment, it's still pretty windy down there. So we've got our crews. We're just making sure that they're safe when they're working on the road. But it's probably going to be closed over. Well, it is going to be closed overnight. But we're pretty confident we're going to get it open reasonably quickly tomorrow morning.
Okay, that's good news. Neil, I'm just treating you like you're a mastermind contestant, really. This is so I'm just tossing roads at you. If you don't have a clue, we won't hold it against you. But can you update us on Nelson? By golly, there was some coastal road damage there in the Nelson region. Are there closures we need to know about?
Rocks Road was that took a bit of a hammering this morning, and that was related to, once again, to tides and so forth. So that road, it's being managed overnight at the moment, so we're just keeping an eye on it. It's open at the moment, and the other road in Nelson was the Takaka Hill was also closed, and that was a result of trees down and that type of thing. So but both roads are open at the moment. Rocks Road, though, we're keeping a careful eye on that overnight to make sure that it's safe for people to travel on.
You're doing a fantastic job, Neil Walker. Anything else we need to know about? State Highway 1, I'm thinking about between Picton and Christchurch. How's that looking?
Yeah, that was closed for a period this morning. That was between Clarence and Kaikoura, and that was due to, once again, we had trees down and that type of thing. They got it open, but of course that closes every night at 8:30. That was open. It'll be open at the moment. There's also a stretch of highway from Greymouth through to Westport, State Highway 6. That's closed at the moment, and it's in a similar situation to the stretch be from Ross down to Makarora.
Okay,
so it's going to be
trees on the road, trees and flooding. Yeah, which means Westport's cut off, really, doesn't it?
No, you can get to Westport via Buller Gorge.
Okay, great.
It was actually closed off earlier today, but Buller Gorge is actually open now, so that's between Anangahura and Westport. So you can go from upper through Reefton to Anangahura and across.
Neil Walker, that's formidable. Just to be able to ask all those questions I was throwing at you, because we had had no discussion in advance about what we're going to talk about. We really appreciate it. Neil Walker from NZTA updating us on the roads. If you are out and about, particularly on coastal roads where there's been flooding, strong winds, look out for trees. Do take care. Thank you for being with us. We'll be back tomorrow at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. 3 people have been taken to hospital with smoke inhalation from a fire that's burning out of control in West Milton, south of Christchurch. Dunedin's mayor says the city's stormwater network couldn't cope with the volume of rain that fell today, causing major flooding in South Dunedin and Mosgiel. 3,000 properties are still without power on the west coast, and some homes in Buller have been affected by untreated sewage after torrential flooding. Nelson Police are urging people to stay home unless absolutely necessary after today's storm surge, and Auckland Transport is planning for tonight's king tide after this morning's caused gridlock in large parts of the city. Our next news and weather is at 7.
In this week's New Horizons, the first new episode for 2018, the theme is brotherhood. After a touch of our own Tim and Neil Finn, I'll be playing music by Brian and Michael